Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is Alan. Today we're going to be discussing the term toxic masculinity, a very controversial and divisive term that most likely is making a portion of you guys watching out there unsubscribe and comment very angrily in the comment section down below so that we can't even have any discourse or discussion about this term. And who's to blame, you guys? I mean, generally the people who talk about toxic masculinity are themselves either women, like my gender's communication professor, who taught me this term almost 10 years ago, or from men who can hardly be described as masculine in the first place. Some of you might be wondering, where do they get authority to talk about masculinity when they clearly don't have any masculine traits themselves? I mean, Disney has clearly tried its best to explain what masculinity is, or at least break down the traditional male hierarchy as they see it. This is what led to the very divisive and overt messaging that was in The Last Jedi. But that was a complete failure. Instead of enlightening or teaching men a way to be less toxic, the arrogance and ham-fisted execution of their narrative has only driven men more to the fringes. To this day, people still see Admiral Holdo as the purple-haired gender studies teacher instead of an important lesson on gender equality, or whatever message Disney is trying to deliver to their overwhelmingly male audience and fan base. It was a huge step backwards for Star Wars and discourse on the subject, because the idea of toxic masculinity shouldn't really be that controversial in the first place. It's this idea that there are certain masculine traits that can lead to negative and poor outcomes for men. If anything, countering toxic masculinity helps men more than any group of people. It is actually in our interests. But sometimes it takes an individual from the tribe who can speak the language to actually explain the problems of that tribe. Which is why it's not surprising that The Mandalorian, driven by Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau, is a perfect and level-headed approach to discussing this concept of toxic masculinity. Now, most people will agree that Mandalorians are probably the most badass and masculine warriors in the galaxy. This is a warrior society in which all social progression is linked to how powerful and strong of an individual you are. The Mandalore, or leader of the entire group, often wins their position through an honor duel to the death with other candidates for the position. I mean, wouldn't it be a cool idea if Donald Trump and Joe Biden fought each other to the death to determine who would become president? I mean, it's very entertaining, but it's a terrible idea. Mandalorian Society embraces common masculine traits like strength, honor, courage, because of the very harsh beginnings this group of people experienced. You see, the original Mandalorians were a group of refugees who were driven off of their homeworld because they lacked the ability to win and overcome adversity. This is kind of what drives the Mandalorians to become a very hyper-masculine society, and it's those same masculine traits that have helped humanity survive against the countless predators and natural disasters early man faced. And so the early Mandalorians, haunted by the loss of their original homeworld, were driven to create a more hardened, militarized, and tough society in the name of survival. In those earlier days, the galaxy was a pretty rough place. The Old Republic was still confined to the core regions of the galaxy, and so there was just chaos everywhere. But at one point, survival no longer became enough. The Mandalorians desired more space, more land. It wasn't even really about survival anymore. It was about domination and expansion. This is sort of a corruption of the masculine traits that helped the Mandalorian survive in the first place. It's a trait that went too much towards the excess. And so the Mandalorians started conquering other planets, exterminating other alien species, and doing all sorts of crazy and over-the-top stuff. The Mandalorian Empire was an empire soaked in blood. The Mandalorians destroyed entire planets, genocided entire species that they viewed as weak, and eventually drew the ire of the Old Republican Jedi. Despite being clearly outgunned and outnumbered, the Mandalorians rejected rationality and embraced those very toxic traits that they had developed over many years of conquest and domination. And so the Mandalorians ultimately were defeated when the entire galaxy decided to unite against them. And so those early ideas of masculinity that helped the Mandalorians survive now rushed the Mandalorian people straight into disaster and destruction. It was clearly toxic that their entire government system was based on putting the strongest and best fighters in positions of power. Mandalore the Ultimate was a great fighter, but ultimately lacked the wisdom and humility to know when his crusade had overreached. His aggression and hatred also probably made it easier for the Sith Emperor to control him and use him as a proxy to attack the Republic in the first place. Mandalore the Indomitable, who preceded him, fell to a similar set of circumstances, and both Mandalores were driven by foolish pride and a sense of invincibility and believed that they could actually best Jedi in combat, despite the fact that those force-wielding individuals were basically superhuman. And so in order to not lose face in front of their warriors, these Mandalorian leaders enter an unwinnable situation and throw away their leadership to individuals who don't even care about the Mandalorians. Masculinity is a social construct. It's just made up by people. So there are negative traits, neutral traits, and positive traits. It really does vary from group to group and depending on what time period they're in. For instance, in modern day America, pink might seem like an effeminate color, but according to the Ladies' Home Journal in 1918, it was a general rule that boys in America should be dressed in pink and girls should wear blue. Human social development generally lacks foresight and therefore is reactionary. But as often happens, a lot of times our social norms lag behind the actual circumstances our society is undergoing. And so when the Mandalorians were refugees, it actually was beneficial to have a highly militarized and masculine society because that helped them survive the various threats that were trying to attack them. But once they had carved out territory for themselves and found stability, their culture failed to evolve from that more aggressive past. And once the Mandalorians encountered the much larger Old Republic, who some might argue had a much more enlightened society, the Mandalorians' cruel and violent culture was incompatible. The Mandalorians could have made peace with the Old Republic. They could have focused on domestic policy that would have strengthened their society and therefore ensured their legacy. They could have done this by preserving the very positive masculine traits their society possessed, like self-reliance, courage, a sense of honor and duty to protect the weak and needy. Thousands of years later, the Mandalorians are completely devastated, their home planet is in ruins, and we meet a man named Din Djarin. At first, he seems like a pretty unremarkable character. He clearly is a Mandalorian. He has the armor, the guns, and the swag. He's a bounty hunter, and so he adheres closely to rules and laws of the Bounty Hunter Guild. But upon getting a contract to eliminate a tiny, adorable baby Yoda, the Mandalorian decides to go against the rules and save it instead. And so we as an audience are tricked. This isn't a show about, super tough Mandalorian warriors who adhere to a strict code and, this is the way. This is actually a show about individuals who reject convention, who reject social construct and make rules up for themselves because they believe in independent thought. Din Djarin comes from a rigid society that has evolved in the face of overwhelming danger. The Mandalorians during his time period are once again on the run and refugees. The Great Purge has destroyed what was left of their people on Mandalore. But instead of giving into fear and letting the group think for him, Din Djarin looks at each situation closely as an individual and not just some mindless follower. And because of that, he's able to make the right choices more often than not. Mainstream masculine culture tells you to never hit a woman, but in the case of Gina Carano, not only is she bigger and stronger than Din Djarin, she's probably much more masculine as well. So it's almost foolish for Din Djarin to not punch her back or kick her in the ovaries or, to be honest, just run away from her. Because rules and guidelines are there to protect us, but they're rarely specific or flexible enough to truly give us a good solution to every problem. In the history of human society, the most successful individuals, the ones that have benefited society the most, have blazed their own paths and rejected this idea of allowing other people to think for them. Because we are all unique, and as individuals, only we know what is really the right path for ourselves. Which is why we'll become a more enlightened and kind society if we question why we do things instead of just accepting things because that's just how things are done. And this is especially important for our younger viewers who might be in school or just trying to figure out how to fit into society and find themselves. Too much of our evolutionary past is based on this need to socialize and conform for the sake of harmony. Which is why we're more likely to agree with things that we don't really agree with just for the sake of peace, or let other people think for us, like determining what is masculine or what's not, or what is cool or what's not. And rest assured, just like Din Djarin, your journey through life will be full of mistakes and missteps if you try to be an individual. So ultimately, the definition of masculinity varies depending on the individual who is talking about it. So what is important is that we look at our own personal definition of masculinity and determine which parts of our definition leads to positive outcomes and which parts of our definition leads to negative outcomes. Without being able to reflect on our own actions and behavior, we are unable to grow. And that's what being a human is all about. It's about progression, adaptability, and all these other wonderful things. So don't let the media or a movie trigger you over a word that in itself is completely harmless and actually has some very valuable insight into who we are as people. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I know this one was a little controversial, but at the end of the day, life is a movie and you are the protagonist. So do what you will with it.